Sometimes the hardest thing about running away is when the past finally catches up with you. For Caroline Torres, that moment came on a quiet October afternoon in the Colorado mountains. 15 years after she thought she had buried her old life forever, she found the injured dog lying beside a familiar trail. The golden retriever was barely breathing, its fur matted with blood from what looked like a bad fall. Caroline had seen wounded animals before in these mountains, but something about this one made her hands shake as she knelt down to help. The dog wore a simple brass collar, scratched and worn from years of use. When Caroline turned the tag over to read it, the name engraved there made her heart stop cold. It was a name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 15 years. A name that belonged to someone she had loved and lost in the worst way possible. Tommy. How could this dog, lost and dying in the middle of nowhere, carry the exact name that had driven her to these mountains? Who had sent it here, and what did they want from her after all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Caroline's hands trembled as she cradled the wounded retriever against her chest, the brass collar cold against her palm. The name Tommy seemed to burn into her vision, each letter a small knife twisting in old wounds she thought had finally scarred over. She forced herself to breathe, to think practically. The dog needed help, and her feelings about the name would have to wait. Her cabin sat nestled in a grove of aspen trees, 3 miles up the mountain from the nearest road. She had chosen this place deliberately, isolated enough that visitors were rare, accessible enough that she could still guide the occasional hiker who paid her bills. The structure itself was modest but solid, built by her own hands from local timber and river stone. Solar panels gleamed on the south-facing roof, and a small windmill turned lazily in the afternoon breeze. This was her sanctuary, her fortress against a world that had taken everything from her. The dog's breathing grew more labored as Caroline climbed the familiar path to her front door. Blood seeped through the animal's golden coat, and she could feel its ribs expanding with obvious effort. Whatever had happened to this creature, it was serious. She kicked open her door and laid the dog gently on the thick wool rug beside her stone fireplace. "Easy now," she whispered, her voice rusty from days of solitude. "Let me see what we're dealing with." Caroline had learned basic veterinary skills during her early years in the mountains. When you live this far from civilization, you either learn to handle emergencies yourself or you watch things die. She had watched enough things die in her previous life. The dog's injuries appeared to be from a fall, deep gashes along its left side, a possible concussion, and what felt like a cracked rib. Serious, but not necessarily fatal if treated properly. As she worked, cleaning wounds and applying bandages from her well-stocked first aid kit, Caroline's mind wandered to the small stone cairn she had built in her garden years ago. She visited it every morning and evening, a private ritual that marked the beginning and end of each day. The memorial stone represented everything she had lost and everything she was trying to forget. Tommy's name on this dog's collar felt like a violation of that sacred space, a cruel joke played by a universe that had already taken more than its share. The dog's eyes fluttered open as Caroline finished wrapping its ribs. They were warm brown, intelligent and grateful. For a moment, she allowed herself to meet that gaze, to acknowledge the trust the animal was placing in her. Then she looked away, hardening her heart against the connection she could feel forming. "Don't get attached," she told herself, the same words she had repeated every day for 15 years. Nothing good comes from getting attached. But even as she spoke the words, Caroline found herself stroking the dog's head, feeling the soft warmth of its fur beneath her fingers. The animal leaned into her touch, and something long frozen in her chest began to crack. A knock at her door startled them both. Caroline froze, her hand still resting on the dog's head. In 15 years, only one person had ever come to her cabin uninvited. Frank Dalton owned the ranch at the base of the mountain, and at 78, he was the closest thing to a neighbor she had. More importantly, he was the only person in Pine Ridge who knew enough about her past to leave her alone. Caroline. "You up there, girl?" Frank's gravelly voice carried through the heavy wooden door. "Saw you heading up the trail with something in your arms. Everything all right?" She hesitated. Frank had been good to her over the years, respecting her need for solitude while making sure she didn't completely disappear from the world. He brought her supplies when the weather was bad, shared news from town when she needed to know it, and never asked questions about the life she had left behind. But letting him see the dog meant explaining the collar, and she wasn't ready for those questions. "I'm fine, Frank," she called back. "Just helping an injured animal. Mind if I take a look?" "Been doctoring animals longer than you've been breathing." The offer was tempting. Frank's veterinary experience far exceeded her own, and the dog could use professional attention. But Caroline couldn't shake the feeling that showing him the collar would set something in motion she wasn't prepared to handle. "Really, I've got it under control," she said. "But thank you." A long pause followed. Caroline could picture Frank standing on her porch, weighing her words against his concern. Finally, his boots scraped against the wooden planks as he shifted his weight. "All right, then. But if you change your mind, you know where to find me." "And Caroline?" Another pause. "Whatever's got you spooked up there, you don't have to face it alone." His footsteps retreated down the mountain path, leaving Caroline alone with the dog and her racing thoughts. Frank's words echoed in her mind. "Whatever's got you spooked." The old rancher was more perceptive than she gave him credit for. Something about this situation felt wrong, felt planned in a way that made her skin crawl. Caroline returned to the dog, checking its pulse and temperature. The animal was stable for now, but it would need several days of careful nursing to fully recover. Several days of having this living reminder of her son's name in her sanctuary. Several days of wondering who had sent it and why. She had come to these mountains 15 years ago, carrying nothing but a backpack and enough pain to kill a lesser person. The early years had been brutal, learning to survive alone, fighting off the demons that followed her into the wilderness, slowly building the walls that kept the outside world at bay. She had earned her solitude through suffering, and she wasn't ready to give it up. But as she watched the dog sleep, its breathing steady and peaceful, Caroline felt something she hadn't experienced in years, responsibility for another living thing. The feeling terrified her almost as much as the name on the collar. She built up the fire and settled into her reading chair, keeping one eye on her unexpected patient. Outside, the October wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding her that winter wasn't far away. Soon the snows would come, cutting off easy access to the cabin for months at a time. If whoever had sent this dog was planning something, they were running out of time to act. Caroline pulled a thick wool blanket around her shoulders and tried to lose herself in a book, but the words blurred together on the page. Every few minutes, her gaze drifted to the sleeping dog and the collar that gleamed dully in the firelight. Tommy, the name that had once meant everything to her, now attached to a creature whose very presence felt like a threat. As darkness fell over the mountains, Caroline found herself keeping vigil beside the dog, unable to sleep, unable to look away. She had spent 15 years running from her past, but somehow it had found her anyway. And it had arrived wearing the face of her greatest loss. The memorial stone in her garden had been built from rocks she had carried up the mountain one by one, each stone a prayer for peace, a plea for forgiveness. Tomorrow she would visit it again, as she had every day since building it. But for the first time in years, she wasn't sure what she would say when she got there. The dog stirred in its sleep, making small whimpering sounds that tore at Caroline's heart. Without thinking, she reached out and stroked its head, whispering the kind of comfort she had once given to another golden-haired creature who had needed her protection. "It's all right," she whispered. "You're safe now." But as the words left her lips, Caroline wondered if either of them would be safe much longer. Someone knew where she was. Someone had sent this dog to find her. And after 15 years of hiding, the reckoning she had always feared was finally at hand. Caroline spent a restless night beside the injured dog, dozing fitfully in her chair while monitoring its breathing. By dawn, the animal's condition had stabilized enough that she felt comfortable leaving it for a few hours. The nearest veterinarian was Dr. Emily Chen in Pine Ridge, 30 miles down winding mountain roads. Caroline rarely made the trip to town, but the dog's injuries were beyond her basic first aid skills. She loaded the retriever carefully into the bed of her old pickup truck, cushioning it with blankets and securing a tarp overhead to block the wind. The dog remained docile during the transfer, as if it understood she was trying to help. Its calm acceptance of human handling suggested it was well trained and socialized, not a wild animal, but someone's beloved pet. The drive to Pine Ridge took her past landmarks she usually avoided, the elementary school where children played on swings Tommy would never use again, the baseball diamond where Little League games continued without him, the cemetery where she had never been able to bring herself to visit his grave. Each familiar sight was a small dagger to her carefully protected heart. Dr. Chen's clinic sat on the outskirts of town, a modest building with cheerful blue shutters and a hand-painted sign featuring various farm animals. Caroline had met the veterinarian a few times over the years when treating sick wildlife, and she respected the younger woman's skill and discretion. If anyone could help the dog without asking too many uncomfortable questions, it would be Emily. The vet emerged from the clinic as Caroline pulled into the parking lot, alerted by the sound of the truck's engine. Emily Chen was in her early 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the practical demeanor of someone who had seen every kind of animal emergency. She helped Caroline carry the dog into an examination room without comment, her professional focus entirely on the patient. "Looks like he took quite a tumble," Emily said, running practiced hands over the dog's body. "These injuries are consistent with a fall down rocky terrain." "How did you find him?" "On the trail near my cabin," Caroline replied, watching as Emily checked the dog's pupils and heart rate. "He was barely conscious." Emily nodded, making notes on a chart. "He's lucky you found him when you did." Another few hours in this condition, and hypothermia would have been a real concern. She paused her examination to look directly at Caroline. "Have you checked for identification?" "A collar or microchip?" Caroline's throat tightened. "There's a collar. May I see it?" With reluctance, Caroline pointed to the brass tag hanging from the leather strap around the dog's neck. Emily lifted it gently, squinting at the engraved text. Her expression shifted from professional interest to something more complicated. Surprise mixed with what might have been recognition. "Tommy," Emily read aloud. "Interesting name." She looked up at Caroline with new curiosity. "Do you know this dog?" "No," Caroline said quickly. "I've never seen it before." Emily continued her examination, but Caroline could sense the vet's increased attention to details. Professional veterinarians were trained observers, skilled at reading both animals and their owners. Emily's silence felt weighted with unasked questions. "I'll need to check for a microchip," Emily said after completing her physical assessment. "Most dogs this well cared for will have one." She retrieved a scanner from a nearby cabinet and ran it over the dog's shoulder area. The device beeped almost immediately. "There it is," Emily said, reading the number from the scanner's display. "Let me look this up in the registry database." She moved to her computer and typed in the microchip number. Caroline watched her face as information populated the screen, saw the moment when professional courtesy shifted to genuine concern. "This is unusual," Emily said slowly. "The dog is registered to someone named David Torres in Denver, but there's a note in the file, a very specific note." She turned the monitor so Caroline could see the screen. "It says that if this dog is ever found injured or lost, the owner should not be contacted first. Instead, the finder should be directed to contact you specifically." Caroline's blood ran cold. "That's impossible. The note includes your full name and the general area where you live. It also includes instructions that you should be told the dog belongs to someone who needs to see you again, and that it's time to finish what was started." Emily's voice grew more concerned with each word. "Caroline, do you know what this means?" The room seemed to tilt around Caroline. "David Torres, her ex-husband. The man she had fled from 15 years ago, who blamed her for their son's death and had made her life unbearable with his accusations and rage. Somehow he had found her. Somehow he had orchestrated this encounter. "I need to leave," Caroline said, standing abruptly. The dog lifted its head at her sudden movement, brown eyes tracking her with what seemed like understanding. "Wait," Emily said, stepping between Caroline and the door. "If someone is using this animal to track you down, that's stalking. That's illegal. We should call the police." "No police," Caroline said firmly. "Please, just treat the dog. I'll pay for everything." Emily studied her for a long moment. "Caroline, I don't know what happened between you and David Torres, but this feels calculated, dangerous. At minimum, you should talk to Deputy Santos. She's good people, and she understands domestic situations." The mention of law enforcement made Caroline's chest tighten with familiar panic. She had spent 15 years avoiding any kind of official attention, any situation that might connect her current life to her past. Getting the police involved would mean questions, investigations, possibly exposing the new identity she had built for herself in the mountains. "I just need to think," Caroline said. "How long will the dog need to recover?" "A few days, maybe a week if you want him fully healed. The injuries aren't life-threatening, but they need proper care." Emily's expression softened. "Caroline, you don't have to handle this alone. Whatever this David Torres wants, there are people who can help protect you." Caroline looked down at the dog, which continued to watch her with those intelligent brown eyes. She could abandon it here, drive back to her cabin, and pretend this had never happened. She could pack her few belongings and disappear deeper into the wilderness, start over again in some other remote corner of the world. She had done it before, but something in the dog's gaze held her. It wasn't the animal's fault that it had been turned into a weapon against her. It was just another victim of David's obsession with the past, his inability to let their tragedy rest in peace. "I'll take him home," Caroline said finally, "and I'll think about what you've said." Emily nodded reluctantly and provided Caroline with medical supplies and detailed care instructions. As they loaded the dog back into the truck, the vet grabbed Caroline's arm gently. "Promise me you'll be careful," Emily said, "and promise me you'll call if you need help. I'll keep this visit confidential for now, but if I think you're in real danger, I'll have to involve the authorities." Caroline drove back toward the mountains with her mind racing. David had found her. After 15 years of hiding, her ex-husband had somehow tracked her down and was using their son's name as a weapon to draw her out. The veterinary records proved this was no coincidence. David had planned this encounter, possibly for months or even years. As the truck climbed the winding mountain road, Caroline glanced in her rearview mirror at the dog resting peacefully in the truck bed. Tommy, the name that had once filled her heart with joy, now felt like a curse. David knew exactly what that name would do to her. Knew she wouldn't be able to abandon an animal that carried their son's memory. The afternoon sun was low in the sky by the time Caroline reached her cabin. She helped the dog inside and settled it on the rug beside the fireplace, then stood at her window, looking out at the memorial stone in her garden. For 15 years, that small cairn had been her private shrine to grief, her daily ritual of remembrance and regret. Now it felt like a target David had been aiming at all along. Caroline walked outside and knelt beside the stone memorial she had built for Tommy. Her hands traced the smooth river rock she had carried up the mountain one by one, each stone a prayer for peace that had never come. She had thought distance and solitude would eventually heal her wounds, but David's message was clear. There would be no peace until they faced their shared past. Inside the cabin, the dog lifted its head as she returned, tail giving a tentative wag. Caroline felt her resolve waver. She had spent 15 years avoiding any connection that might cause her pain, but this animal's simple gratitude threatened to crack the protective walls around her heart. "What does he want from me?" she whispered to the dog, as if it might have answers. "What could possibly be worth all this effort?" The dog whimpered softly and tried to stand, its bandaged ribs obviously causing discomfort. Without thinking, Caroline knelt beside it and offered the comfort of her touch. The animal leaned into her warmth, and she felt the dangerous stirring of emotions she had thought were safely buried. As darkness settled over the mountains, Caroline realized she was no longer alone in her sanctuary. The dog's presence changed everything, forcing her to care for another living thing while carrying the threat of her ex-husband's intentions. David had chosen his weapon well. He knew she wouldn't be able to resist helping an injured animal, especially one that bore their son's name. But what David didn't know was how much she had changed during her years in the wilderness. The broken woman who had fled Denver 15 years ago was gone, replaced by someone who understood survival, who had learned to face harsh truths alone. If he wanted a confrontation, she would give him one, but it would be on her terms, not his. Caroline checked the dog's bandages one final time and settled into her chair for another long night of watching and waiting. Tomorrow, she would begin preparing for whatever David had planned. Tonight, she would simply sit with this innocent creature and remember what it felt like to have something worth protecting again. Caroline woke to the sound of the dog whimpering softly beside her chair. Dawn light filtered through the cabin windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. She had dozed fitfully through the night, startling awake at every small sound, hyper-aware of her vulnerability now that David knew her location. The dog, she found herself thinking of it as Scout. Though she tried to resist naming it, was trying to stand despite his obvious discomfort. Caroline knelt beside him and checked his bandages, relieved to see that the bleeding had stopped completely. His brown eyes met hers with gratitude and something else, of intelligence that suggested this was no ordinary pet. "Easy there," she murmured, helping him settle back down. "You need more time to heal." As she prepared Scout's morning meal, Caroline's mind wandered to memories she usually kept locked away. Tommy had been 8 when they got their first dog, a golden retriever puppy named Buster that had brought such joy to their Denver suburban home. Tommy had insisted on training Buster himself, spending hours in the backyard teaching the puppy to sit, stay, and fetch. The sight of her son's patient persistence with that gangly puppy had filled Caroline with such pride. Those had been the good years, before the diagnosis that changed everything. David had been a devoted father then, coaching Tommy's Little League team and taking him camping in the mountains every summer. They had been a normal family with normal problems, mortgage payments and parent-teacher conferences and arguments about bedtime. Simple problems that seemed laughably trivial now. Caroline shook her head, forcing the memories back into their locked compartment. Dwelling on the past was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when David was apparently planning some kind of confrontation. She needed to focus on the present. On understanding what Scout's presence really meant, she searched through her closet for additional medical supplies and found something that made her breath catch. Tommy's old baseball glove, hidden behind a box of winter clothes she rarely used. The leather was still supple despite the years, still shaped by her son's small hand. She had kept it without really knowing why, unable to throw it away, but unable to look at it either. The glove trembled in her hands as memories flooded back unbidden. Tommy practicing his throw in the backyard, his face scrunched in concentration as he tried to perfect his form. David teaching him to oil the leather properly, explaining the importance of taking care of equipment. The sound of the ball smacking into the pocket, over and over, until it became the soundtrack of their summer evenings. Scout lifted his head at the sound of Caroline's sharp intake of breath. She realized she was crying, something she hadn't done in years. The tears felt foreign on her cheeks, a weakness she couldn't afford. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the glove, though she wasn't sure who she was apologizing to. Tommy for not being able to save him. David for the choices she had made. Herself for running instead of staying to fight. A soft knock at her door interrupted her breakdown. Caroline quickly wiped her eyes and shoved the baseball glove back into the closet, then checked the window to see Frank Dalton standing on her porch with a concerned expression. "Caroline?" Frank called out. "I brought some supplies from town. Thought you might need them for your patient." She hesitated, then opened the door. Frank's weathered face creased with worry as he took in her appearance, the dark circles under her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing nervously at the surrounding forest. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Girl," Frank said, stepping inside without invitation. His eyes immediately found Scout, and Caroline saw the old rancher's expression shift to professional interest. "Well now, that's a fine-looking retriever. What happened to him?" "Found him injured on the trail," Caroline said. The same explanation she had given Dr. Chen. But Frank had been around animals his whole life, and his examination of Scout was more thorough than Caroline would have liked. "Interesting," Frank murmured, running his hands along Scout's body with the confidence of decades of veterinary experience. "These injuries are consistent with a fall, but look at this muscle development. This dog has had professional training, search and rescue, maybe military or police work. See how he responds to commands?" As if to demonstrate Frank's point, Scout immediately sat when the old man made a subtle hand gesture. Caroline felt her stomach drop. She hadn't noticed the dog's unusual responsiveness to human signals, but now it was obvious. Scout wasn't just a pet, he was a working animal with specialized training. "Where did you say you found him?" Frank asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Near the deer trail, about 2 miles from here," Caroline replied. Trying to keep her voice steady, Frank nodded slowly, but Caroline could see the questions building behind his eyes. The old rancher had been her neighbor long enough to recognize when she was hiding something important. "Caroline," Frank said gently, "I've lived in these mountains for 50 years. I know when something's not right. This dog didn't just wander up here and fall off a cliff. Someone trained him, someone sent him, and someone's probably looking for him." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Caroline considered lying, making up some story about hikers passing through. But Frank's steady gaze told her he wouldn't accept any easy answers. "It's complicated," she said finally. "Most important things are," Frank replied. "But complicated doesn't mean you have to handle it alone. I may be old, but I'm not useless, and I care what happens to you." His kindness threatened to crack her carefully maintained composure. For 15 years, Frank had been the only person who knew even fragments of her story. Not the details, but enough to understand why she needed solitude and respect. He had never pushed for more information than she was willing to give, never made her feel like she owed him explanations for her choices. "Someone from my past is trying to contact me," Caroline admitted. "The dog belongs to them." Frank's expression hardened. "Someone who means you harm?" "I don't know," Caroline said honestly. "Maybe, probably." "Then we need to talk to Deputy Santos," Frank said immediately. "Maria's good people, and she understands that sometimes the past follows folks into these mountains." Caroline shook her head. "I can't involve the police." "Not yet." Frank studied her for a long moment, weighing her words against his concern. "All right," he said finally. "But you're not facing this alone. I'll be keeping a closer eye on things around here. And I want you to promise me you'll call if you need help." "Frank, I don't want you getting involved in my problems." "Too late for that," the old rancher interrupted. "You've been my neighbor for 15 years. That makes your problems my problems, whether you like it or not." After Frank left, Caroline found herself studying Scout with new eyes. The dog's behavior during the visit had been telling. He had responded immediately to Frank's subtle commands, demonstrating a level of training that went far beyond basic pet obedience. This wasn't just David's beloved pet. It was a tool, possibly a weapon designed to locate and track her. But as she watched Scout struggle to his feet and approach her food bowl, Caroline saw something else in his demeanor. The dog seemed conflicted, as if his training was warring with some deeper instinct. When he looked at her, there was genuine affection in his eyes, not just the mechanical obedience of a working animal. "What did they do to you?" she whispered, kneeling beside him. "What are you supposed to do when you find me?" Scout tilted his head at her words, and Caroline could swear she saw understanding in his expression. Whatever his original purpose, the dog was forming his own opinion about her, making his own choices about where his loyalty belonged. As the day progressed, Caroline began to notice other things about Scout's behavior that suggested specialized training. He positioned himself where he could watch both her and the cabin's entrances simultaneously. He reacted to sounds from outside with alert attention, but no panic, as if he had been trained to gather information rather than simply bark at threats. Most unsettling of all, he seemed to be watching her routines, learning her patterns with the systematic attention of a surveillance animal. The realization that she was being observed and catalogued by David's agent, even an innocent four-legged one, made Caroline's skin crawl. But it also sparked something else in her chest: anger. After 15 years of grief and guilt, she was finally feeling something stronger than resignation. David wanted a confrontation. He was going to get one. But Caroline Torres was no longer the broken woman who had fled Denver in the night. She had learned to survive in the wilderness, to face harsh truths and impossible choices. If her ex-husband thought he could intimidate her with psychological games and surveillance animals, he was about to learn how much she had changed. Scout settled beside her chair as evening approached, his head resting near her feet. Despite everything, Caroline found herself stroking his ears, offering comfort to this innocent creature caught in the middle of someone else's war. The dog's gratitude was genuine, even if his presence served David's purposes. "I won't let him hurt you," she promised Scout quietly. "Whatever he trained you to do, whatever he expects from this encounter, you're safe with me." As if he understood her words, Scout's tail thumped once against the floor. In that moment, Caroline realized that David had made a crucial miscalculation. He had sent Scout to find her, to track her, and probably to keep her in place until he could arrive. But by doing so, he had given her something she hadn't had in 15 years, a reason to fight back instead of run away. Caroline's sleep had become fractured. Plagued by dreams that mixed memory with nightmare, she would see Tommy running through fields of golden grass, always just out of reach, while David's voice called from somewhere behind her, demanding answers she couldn't give. She would wake with her heart pounding, Scout's warm presence beside her chair, the only thing anchoring her to the present. On the third morning after finding Scout, Caroline discovered something that made her blood run cold. While checking the perimeter of her property, a routine she had started since realizing someone knew her location, she found evidence of surveillance equipment hidden among the trees. The devices were sophisticated, nearly invisible unless you knew what to look for. Positioned to monitor the approaches to her cabin, the hospital bracelet she found that afternoon, while searching her jewelry box for a magnifying glass to examine the surveillance equipment, brought her to her knees. Tommy's patient wristband from his final hospital stay, yellowed with age but still legible. She had kept it hidden away, unable to look at it, but unable to throw it away. The bracelet read Thomas Torres, age 12. Oncology. Seeing it again transported her instantly back to those terrible final weeks, when hope had become a cruel joke, and every day brought new evidence that they were losing the fight. She remembered cutting the bracelet from Tommy's thin wrist after he died, her hands shaking so badly the nurse had to help her. Scout seemed to sense her distress, moving closer and pressing his warm body against her legs. The gesture was comforting, but it also reminded Caroline that this animal had been sent to find her, possibly to monitor her emotional state and report back to David. "What are you really here for?" she asked Scout, studying his intelligent brown eyes. "Are you just supposed to keep me here until he arrives?" The dog tilted his head at her words, and Caroline noticed something new in his expression: conflict. His training was clearly at odds with the genuine bond he was forming with her. Whatever David had programmed into him, Scout was developing his own opinions about the situation. Caroline's research into the surveillance equipment revealed disturbing details. The devices were military-grade, capable of recording both audio and video for weeks at a time. They had been positioned recently. The mounting hardware showed no weather aging, which meant someone had been on her property within the last few weeks. Possibly while she was away guiding hikers, a call to Dr. Chen confirmed her worst fears about Scout's background. The veterinarian had done some discreet research and discovered that the dog had been reported missing from a private security company in Denver 3 weeks earlier. The company specialized in training animals for search and rescue operations, but also had contracts with law enforcement and private investigators. Caroline, Dr. Chen said carefully over the phone, "This dog isn't just trained, he's a professional tracking animal. Someone paid a lot of money to have him find you specifically." The implications were staggering. David hadn't just stumbled across her location. He had hired professionals to locate her and had been planning this encounter for months, possibly years. The surveillance equipment, Scout's specialized training, the psychological manipulation of using Tommy's name, all of it pointed to an elaborate campaign designed to force a confrontation. That evening, Caroline experienced her first panic attack in years. It started as a tightness in her chest while she was preparing dinner, then escalated into full-blown terror as the walls of her sanctuary seemed to close in around her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't escape the feeling that David was already there, watching her from the shadows. Scout's response was immediate and trained. The dog moved to her side, pressing against her legs with steady pressure while making soft, calming sounds. His behavior was too specific, too practiced to be natural instinct. He had been trained to respond to human panic attacks, probably as part of his search and rescue certification. "You've done this before," Caroline gasped, struggling to control her breathing. "How many people have you helped find?" As her panic subsided, replaced by the familiar weight of Scout's presence, Caroline began to piece together a clearer picture of David's plan. Her ex-husband had hired professionals to locate her, had them plant surveillance equipment around her property, and had sent Scout not just to find her, but to monitor her psychological state. David was collecting information, preparing for some kind of confrontation that required detailed knowledge of her current mental condition. The realization that she had been watched for weeks, possibly months, violated every aspect of the sanctuary she had built in the mountains. Her daily routines, her private moments of grief at Tommy's memorial stone, her conversations with Frank, all of it had been recorded and analyzed by strangers working for her ex-husband. Caroline retrieved an old laptop from her closet and spent hours researching David's current life. What she found surprised her. Her ex-husband had become a successful architect in Denver, remarried, and apparently built a stable life for himself. His social media presence showed a man who had moved on from their shared tragedy, someone who seemed to have found peace. But Caroline knew David well enough to recognize the performance. He had always been good at presenting the right image to the world while nursing private resentments. The fact that he had spent significant money and effort to locate her after 15 years suggested that his apparent stability was a facade. Scout's behavior continued to evolve as his injuries healed. The dog was torn between his training and his growing attachment to Caroline. She could see him struggling with conflicting impulses, the need to maintain his position and monitor her activities versus the genuine affection he was developing for her care and attention. "I know you didn't choose this," Caroline told him as she changed his bandages. "You're just doing what you were trained to do. But I need you to understand something. Whatever David told your handlers about me, whatever story he gave them to justify this operation, I'm not the villain in this situation." Scout's tail wagged slightly at the sound of her voice, and Caroline saw intelligence in his eyes that went beyond simple obedience. This dog was capable of making his own moral judgments, and she could sense him weighing his original mission against the reality of who she actually was. The surveillance equipment remained active around her property, which meant David was still monitoring her activities. Caroline began to carefully alter her routines, testing to see how the watchers would respond. She took longer walks, visited different areas of her property, and made several trips to town, all while observing Scout's reactions. The dog's behavior became increasingly conflicted as Caroline tested the boundaries of her situation. When she walked toward the road leading away from her property, Scout would position himself between her and the exit, not aggressively, but with clear intent to discourage her from leaving. When she stayed close to the cabin, he relaxed and returned to his role as a recovering patient seeking comfort. "You're supposed to keep me here, aren't you?" Caroline asked him during one of these incidents. "David trained you to make sure I don't run away before he arrives." Scout's response was a soft whine that sounded almost apologetic. Caroline realized that the dog was as much a prisoner of David's plan as she was, forced to choose between his training and his growing loyalty to the woman who had saved his life. By the end of the week, Caroline had confirmed her worst fears. The surveillance equipment was sophisticated enough to track her movements in real time. Scout was trained to prevent her from leaving the area, and David was clearly building towards some kind of confrontation that required her to be physically present. She was being held in her own sanctuary by an elaborate combination of technology and psychological manipulation. But Caroline had also learned something David probably hadn't anticipated. 15 years in the wilderness had taught her things about survival, patience, and strategic thinking that the broken woman who fled Denver had never possessed. If her ex-husband wanted a confrontation, she would give him one, but it would be on her terms, not his. As she sat beside Scout that evening, stroking his head and feeling the complex emotions radiating from the conflicted animal, Caroline began to formulate her own plan. David had made one crucial mistake in his elaborate scheme. He had given her something to protect again. Scout wasn't just a tool anymore. He was an innocent creature caught in the middle of someone else's war. And Caroline would be damned if she let David destroy another life in his quest for whatever twisted resolution he was seeking. "It's going to be all right," she whispered to Scout, meaning it for the first time since finding him on the trail. "I won't let him hurt either of us." Caroline's investigation into David's current life yielded disturbing information that forced her to confront possibilities she had tried to avoid. Her ex-husband hadn't just moved on from their shared tragedy. He had systematically built a new existence that seemed designed to erase any trace of their marriage and Tommy's brief life. His social media profiles mentioned his current wife and stepdaughter, but contained no reference to his first family, no acknowledgement of the son he had once claimed to love more than life itself. The discovery of David's wedding ring in her own belongings hit her like a physical blow. She found it while searching through old legal documents, tucked inside a manila envelope with their divorce papers. She had kept it without really knowing why, unable to throw away this symbol of what they had once been to each other. The simple gold band trembled in her hands as she remembered the day David had placed it on her finger, promising to love her through whatever challenges life might bring. Those promises had been sincere at the time. Caroline could still remember the young man who had courted her with such passionate intensity, who had talked about building a family and growing old together. That David had been kind, ambitious, and devoted to the idea of their shared future. It was hard to reconcile that memory with the man who was now orchestrating this elaborate psychological campaign against her scouts. Behavior began to reveal more about his specialized training as his physical injuries healed. The dog had been taught to track not just physical sense, but emotional states, responding to stress hormones and subtle changes in human behavior that indicated flight risk. When Caroline showed signs of anxiety or made movements toward her truck, Scout would position himself strategically to discourage departure without appearing overtly threatening. "You're good at your job," Caroline told him during one of these incidents. "But I need you to understand that I'm not the enemy here." The dog's internal conflict was becoming more apparent as his bond with Caroline deepened. His training demanded that he keep her in place and monitor her activities. But his genuine affection for her was creating competing loyalties that clearly caused him distress. Caroline decided to test the limits of Scout's programming by taking him on a walk to a specific location on her property, a grove of pine trees where she had once considered building a second cabin. As they approached the area, Scout became agitated, pulling against his leash and whining with obvious discomfort. When Caroline knelt to examine the ground, she found what the dog had been trained to detect: a buried metal box, carefully concealed beneath a layer of pine needles and forest debris. The discovery of the cache sent chills through Caroline's body. Someone had been on her property not just to install surveillance equipment, but to prepare strategic resources for whatever confrontation David was planning. The box contained photographs, dozens of images showing Caroline over the past several years, taken with telephoto lenses from concealed positions around her property. The photographs were disturbing in their intimacy and detail. They showed her tending her garden, reading on her porch, visiting Tommy's memorial stone, and sharing conversations with Frank Dalton. Someone had been documenting her daily life with obsessive thoroughness, collecting evidence of her routines and emotional vulnerabilities. But the most unsettling discovery was at the bottom of the cache, a collection of letters addressed to Caroline but never sent. The handwriting was David's, and the content revealed the depth of his anger and his elaborate plans for forcing a confrontation. The letters detailed his discovery of her location, his decision to hire professionals to monitor her activities, and his growing conviction that she owed him some kind of reckoning for the choices she had made during Tommy's final illness. "You think you can hide from what you did," one letter read. "You think distance and time will wash away your guilt, but I remember everything. I remember how you gave up on him when he needed us to fight. I remember how you chose to let him go instead of trying every possible treatment. You killed our son with your weakness, and I'm going to make sure you finally face what you've done." Caroline's hands shook as she read David's accusations. The letters revealed a man consumed by grief and blame, someone who had spent 15 years nurturing his resentment until it became the driving force of his existence. He hadn't moved on from Tommy's death. He had built his entire life around the need to punish her for it. Dr. Chen's call that afternoon brought additional troubling news. The veterinarian had done more research into Scout's background and discovered that the dog had been specifically conditioned for this mission over a period of months. The training hadn't just focused on tracking and containment. Scout had been exposed to recordings of Caroline's voice and scent samples from her old belongings, creating a psychological profile that allowed him to form an artificial bond with her. "Caroline," Dr. Chen said carefully, "this level of preparation suggests that whoever is behind this has been planning it for a very long time. The conditioning this dog received was extensive and expensive. Someone has been thinking about you for years." The revelation that Scout's affection for her might be artificially induced hit Caroline harder than she expected. She had begun to trust the bond forming between them, seeing it as one genuine thing in a situation built on deception. Now she wasn't sure what was real and what was programmed response, but as she watched Scout sleeping peacefully beside her fireplace that evening, Caroline noticed something that gave her hope. The dog's dreams seemed troubled, and he would occasionally whimper and move his legs as if running from something. His subconscious was clearly processing conflicts that went beyond simple training, suggesting that his emotional responses to her were becoming independent of his original programming. Deputy Sheriff Maria Santos arrived at Caroline's cabin unannounced the next morning, responding to Dr. Chen's concerns about the situation. Santos was a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and the practical demeanor of someone who had dealt with domestic violence cases before. Her presence represented everything Caroline had tried to avoid: official attention, questions about her past, potential exposure of the identity she had built in the mountains. "Ms. Torres," Santos said gently, "Dr. Chen shared some concerns about your safety. I understand someone from your past may be trying to contact you in ways that feel threatening." Caroline hesitated, weighing her options. Involving law enforcement could provide protection, but it would also mean explaining her history and potentially triggering an investigation that might expose details she preferred to keep private. On the other hand, David's letters had revealed intentions that went beyond simple confrontation. He was planning something that could put both her and Scout in real danger. "It's complicated," Caroline said finally. The same words she had used with Frank. "Most domestic situations are," Santos replied. "But complicated doesn't mean you don't deserve protection. Can you tell me about the threats you've received?" Caroline made a decision that would change everything. She retrieved David's letters from their hiding place and handed them to Deputy Santos, watching the officer's expression grow more concerned with each page. The letters provided clear evidence of stalking, harassment, and potentially criminal surveillance activities. "This is serious," Santos said after reading the letters. "We're talking about multiple felonies here. Stalking, surveillance without consent, possibly kidnapping if he's using the dog to restrict your movement. We need to get you somewhere safe while we investigate," but Caroline shook her head. "Running away is what got me into this situation in the first place. If David wants a confrontation, I'm going to give him one, but on my terms, not his." Santos studied her for a long moment, weighing Caroline's determination against her professional obligation to protect potential victims. "All right," she said finally, "but we're going to do this properly, with backup and protection. You're not facing this alone." As Deputy Santos left to coordinate with other law enforcement agencies, Caroline realized that the isolation she had maintained for 15 years was finally ending. David's campaign against her had forced her back into the world, back into relationships and dependencies she had sworn to avoid. But perhaps that was exactly what she needed to finally heal from the wounds that had driven her to the mountains in the first place. The medical file Caroline retrieved from her most secure hiding place was Tommy's complete treatment record, a thick folder she had taken from the hospital against regulations on the day he died. She had told herself she needed it for legal purposes, but the truth was simpler and more painful. She couldn't bear to leave any trace of her son in that sterile place where hope had died by degrees. Opening the file after 15 years was like stepping back into her worst nightmare. Page after page documented Tommy's brave fight against the cancer that had invaded his 12-year-old body with merciless efficiency. The medical terminology couldn't disguise the horror of what her child had endured. Surgery after surgery, treatments that left him weak and nauseated, the gradual erosion of his strength despite everyone's desperate efforts to save him. But it was the notes from the final weeks that brought Caroline to her knees. The oncologist's careful documentation of treatment options, each one carrying smaller chances of success and greater risks of suffering. The record of conversations with both parents about experimental therapies, about quality of life versus quantity of time, about the terrible mathematics of hope when hope itself had become a form of cruelty. Caroline remembered those conversations with crystalline clarity. David had wanted to try everything, to pursue every experimental treatment, regardless of Tommy's suffering. He had been willing to put their son through anything if it offered even a small chance of survival. Caroline had advocated for comfort care, for letting Tommy spend his remaining time at peace rather than in the sterile agony of failed treatments. The fight between them had been bitter and desperate, played out in hospital corridors while their son lay dying in the room beyond. David had accused her of giving up, of choosing the easy path instead of fighting for their child's life. Caroline had accused him of prolonging Tommy's suffering for his own emotional needs, of refusing to accept what the doctors had been trying to tell them for weeks. Scout found her crying over the medical records, her tears falling on pages that documented the worst period of her life. The dog approached cautiously, clearly sensing her distress but uncertain how to respond. His training hadn't prepared him for this level of human anguish, and Caroline could see him struggling between his programmed responses and his genuine desire to comfort her. "He was so brave," Caroline whispered to Scout, her voice breaking on the words. Even at the end, when he was in so much pain, he was more worried about us than himself. He asked me not to let the doctors hurt him anymore, and I promised him I wouldn't. The memory of that final conversation with Tommy brought fresh waves of grief. Her son had been lucid despite the medication, his young face grave, with an understanding no child should have to possess. He had taken her hand in his thin fingers and asked her to make the fighting stop, to let him go peacefully when the time came. I kept my promise, Caroline said to the medical records. To Tommy's memory, to the universe that had taken him too soon. I kept my promise, but David never forgave me for it. Scout settled beside her chair and rested his head on her lap, offering the simple comfort of his presence. Despite everything, his training, his artificial conditioning, his role in David's elaborate plan, the dog's gesture felt genuine. Whatever else was happening, Scout had formed his own opinion about her worth as a human being. The sound of an engine approaching her cabin made Caroline's blood run cold. She quickly gathered the medical records and secured them in their hiding place, then moved to the window to see who was arriving. A black SUV with tinted windows was making its way up the mountain road, driving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Caroline's heart hammered as she realized this might be David himself, finally arriving for the confrontation he had been orchestrating for months. But as the vehicle came closer, she saw it wasn't David behind the wheel. It was a stranger, a tall man in his 50s with silver hair and an expensive suit that looked out of place in the mountain wilderness. Scout's reaction to the newcomer was immediate and intense. The dog began to whine and pace, clearly recognizing the man even before he stepped out of the SUV. When the stranger approached the cabin, Scout positioned himself between Caroline and the door, his body language shifting from protective to conflicted. "Miss Torres," the man called out in a cultured voice that carried traces of an East Coast accent. "My name is Dr. Michael Harrison. I believe we have something important to discuss." The name hit Caroline like a physical blow. Dr. Michael Harrison, Tommy's biological father, a secret she had carried alone for 16 years. The man she had met during a medical conference while David was out of town. A brief affair that had resulted in the pregnancy that became Tommy. The affair that had ended before David returned, leaving Caroline to raise her son as if he belonged to her husband. Only Caroline had known the truth about Tommy's parentage, a secret that had eaten at her conscience throughout her son's life and death. She had convinced herself that David's love for Tommy made him the boy's real father in every way that mattered, that biological facts were less important than emotional bonds. But now, somehow, the truth had been discovered. "I know this is unexpected," Dr. Harrison continued from outside her door, "but recent events have made it necessary for us to meet. I've learned some things about my son's death that require clarification." Caroline's world tilted sideways. If Dr. Harrison knew about Tommy's parentage, that meant David knew too. Her ex-husband's letters had mentioned her guilt and the choices she had made during Tommy's illness, but they hadn't revealed the deeper secret that would explain his need for revenge. "I'm not alone up here," Caroline called out, trying to buy time to think. "People know where I am." "I'm not here to hurt you," Dr. Harrison replied. "I'm here because my investigation into David Torres' activities has revealed some disturbing information. Your ex-husband has been planning something that goes far beyond a simple confrontation." Scout's agitation increased as Dr. Harrison spoke, and Caroline realized the dog had been conditioned to respond to this man as well as to David. The plot against her was more complex than she had understood, involving multiple parties with different agendas but connected goals. "What do you want?" Caroline asked, still standing away from the door. "I want to know why you never told me I had a son," Dr. Harrison said quietly. "And I want to know why David Torres has spent 2 years planning to destroy both of our lives in the name of that son's memory." The revelation that David had known about Tommy's parentage for 2 years changed everything. Caroline thought she understood about the situation. Her ex-husband hadn't just discovered her location. and decided to force a confrontation he had learned. The truth about Tommy's biological father, and had been planning an elaborate revenge that involved both of them. He found out, Caroline said, more to herself than to Dr. Harrison. Somehow, David found out about you. DNA testing, Dr. Harrison confirmed. David had samples from Tommy's medical treatments analyzed 2 years ago. Once he had proof, he began investigating my life and yours, building a case for what he calls justice for our son. Caroline's mind raced as she tried to process the implications. David hadn't just been driven by grief over Tommy's death. He had been consumed by rage over the deception that had defined their entire marriage. He had raised another man's child as his own, loved him, fought for him, mourned him, never knowing that the biological connection he assumed they shared was a lie. What does he want from us? Caroline asked. Acknowledgement, Dr. Harrison replied. Confession. Some form of punishment that he believes will balance the scales for what he sees as our betrayal of Tommy's memory. Scout whined and moved closer to Caroline, his conflict becoming more apparent with each word of the conversation. The dog had been trained to keep her in place until this meeting could occur, but his growing attachment to her was clearly causing him distress about his role in the unfolding drama. Caroline made a decision that surprised even herself. She opened the door and faced Dr. Michael Harrison directly for the first time in 16 years. He was older now, his dark hair silver and his face lined with the weight of recent revelations. But she recognized the man who had briefly shared her life during the loneliest period of her marriage. "All right," she said. "Let's talk." Dr. Michael Harrison entered Caroline's cabin with the cautious movements of a man who understood he was stepping into hostile territory. Scout's reaction to his presence was complex, recognition mixed with confusion, as if the dog's training had prepared him for this encounter, but his developing loyalty to Caroline created internal conflict about how to proceed. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," Harrison said, settling into the chair Caroline indicated. "I know this situation is difficult for all of us." Caroline studied the man who was Tommy's biological father, searching for resemblances she had trained herself not to see during her son's lifetime. The shape of the eyes, the line of the jaw, the way Harrison held his head when thinking, all of it echoed features she had loved in Tommy, but attributed to genetic coincidence rather than hereditary truth. "How long have you known?" Caroline asked directly. 2 years, Harrison admitted. "David contacted me with DNA evidence and a very detailed story about how I had unknowingly fathered his son. His initial approach was civil, almost clinical. He presented it as information I had a right to know. Claimed he wanted to honor Tommy's memory by ensuring all the important people in the boy's life understood their connections." Caroline felt her stomach drop. "But that wasn't really what he wanted." "No," Harrison said grimly. David's true agenda became clear over time. He wasn't interested in honoring Tommy's memory. He was building a case for why both of us deserved to be punished for our roles in what he saw as a massive deception. Harrison reached into his jacket and retrieved a manila envelope, thick with documents and photographs. "This is what David has been assembling for the past 2 years. Evidence of our affair, documentation of the timeline that proves Tommy's parentage, detailed surveillance of both our lives since he made his discovery." Caroline opened the envelope with trembling hands, unprepared for the comprehensive nature of David's investigation. The DNA test results were definitive, showing with 99.7% certainty that Dr. Michael Harrison was Tommy's biological father. But the test had been conducted using tissue samples taken from Tommy's body during his cancer treatment, samples David had somehow obtained from the hospital's pathology department. "He stole tissue samples from our son's body?" Caroline whispered, horrified by the violation this represented. "It gets worse," Harrison said quietly. "Look at the next section." Caroline turned the page and found detailed financial records showing that Harrison had unknowingly paid for many of Tommy's medical expenses. His insurance company had covered treatments at the hospital where he worked, treatments that had been billed under his policy number, despite his having no knowledge of the connection. David discovered that my insurance had been used for Tommy's care, Harrison explained. The hospital's billing department had made an error early in Tommy's treatment, associating his case with my employee number instead of David's. Neither of us knew at the time, but David found the records during his investigation. The implications were staggering. David had discovered not only that Tommy wasn't his biological son, but that the boy's real father had unknowingly contributed to his medical care, while David struggled with insurance co-payments and deductibles. The symbolic weight of this discovery, that Harrison had been supporting his unknown son while David believed he was doing it alone, must have been devastating. "There's more," Harrison said, his voice growing more strained. "David has evidence that I met with Tommy during his treatment, though I had no idea who he was at the time." Caroline found the photographs that documented this revelation, images of Harrison visiting the pediatric oncology ward where Tommy had been treated. As a consulting physician at the hospital, Harrison had occasionally made rounds in that department, and the photos showed him speaking with various young patients, including several interactions with Tommy himself. "He talked to you," Caroline said, studying a photograph that showed Harrison kneeling beside Tommy's wheelchair, both of them smiling. "My son talked to his biological father, and neither of you knew. The nursing staff tells me he was interested in my work," Harrison said softly. "Apparently, he asked intelligent questions about medical research and cancer treatment. They said he was remarkably mature for his age, very thoughtful about the science behind his own illness." Caroline remembered Tommy mentioning the nice doctor who had explained complicated medical concepts in terms a 12-year-old could understand. Her son had been fascinated by the technical aspects of his treatment, finding comfort in understanding the processes his body was undergoing. She had been grateful that someone was taking time to satisfy his curiosity, never imagining the cosmic cruelty that had brought father and son together in those brief moments. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. At the bottom of David's evidence file was a report from a private investigator detailing Caroline's affair with Harrison, including hotel receipts, credit card records, and even photographs taken during their brief relationship 16 years earlier. "David hired investigators to reconstruct our entire affair," Caroline said, her voice hollow with shock. "He has evidence of every moment we spent together, including the night Tommy was conceived," Harrison confirmed. "The investigators were very thorough. They tracked down hotel staff who remembered us, retrieved security footage that hadn't been destroyed, even interviewed conference attendees who might have seen us together. The level of obsession required for such detailed investigation was frightening." David hadn't just discovered the truth about Tommy's parentage. He had immersed himself in recreating the circumstances of the deception, forcing himself to relive Caroline's betrayal with forensic precision. "But why involve you directly?" Caroline asked. "If David wanted revenge against me, why bring you into it?" Harrison's expression darkened. "Because his definition of justice requires both of us to face consequences. In David's mind, you betrayed him by concealing Tommy's parentage, but I betrayed Tommy by remaining ignorant of his existence. He believes we both failed our son in different but equally damaging ways." The twisted logic of David's reasoning became clear as Caroline processed the full scope of his evidence. He had convinced himself that Tommy's death was somehow connected to the deception surrounding his parentage, that the boy might have survived if the adults in his life had been honest about their relationships and responsibilities. "He thinks Tommy died because we were living a lie," Caroline said, understanding dawning with horrible clarity. "Exactly," Harrison confirmed. "David has convinced himself that our deception created some kind of cosmic imbalance that cost Tommy his life. He wants us to confess our sins publicly, to acknowledge our roles in what he sees as Tommy's betrayal, and to accept punishment that he believes will restore some kind of moral order to the universe." Scout whined softly from his position beside Caroline's chair, and she realized the dog's training had included preparation for this exact revelation. David had anticipated her emotional response to learning about Harrison's involvement and had conditioned Scout to provide comfort during psychological distress while maintaining his surveillance role. The dog is part of the psychological manipulation, Caroline said, finally understanding the full complexity of David's plan. Scout was trained to monitor my emotional state during these revelations, to keep me stable enough to participate in whatever confrontation David has planned. Harrison nodded grimly. David has spent 2 years planning this encounter, accounting for every variable he could anticipate. He wants us both present, both emotionally vulnerable, both forced to confront the consequences of choices we made 16 years ago. Caroline stood and walked to her window, looking out at the memorial stone she had built for Tommy. For 15 years, that cairn had represented her private grief and guilt. Now she understood that it had also been observed and documented by David's surveillance operation, turned into evidence of her ongoing deception about Tommy's true parentage. "When is he coming?" Caroline asked. "Soon," Harrison replied. "My arrival here was meant to trigger the final phase of his plan. David is probably already on his way up the mountain." Caroline turned back to face Harrison, seeing him clearly for the first time since he had entered her cabin. This man was Tommy's biological father, the genetic source of her son's intelligence and curiosity and strength. But he was also a stranger who had been manipulated into this situation by David's obsessive need for revenge. "I'm sorry," Caroline said quietly. "I'm sorry you never knew about Tommy, and I'm sorry you're being dragged into this nightmare because of choices I made." Harrison's expression softened. "We both made choices, Caroline, and we both paid prices we never anticipated. But I need you to understand something. Despite everything, despite the circumstances and the deception and the tragedy, I'm grateful to know that I had a son, even if I never got the chance to be his father." Scout moved between them, as if sensing the emotional weight of the conversation. The dog looked up at Caroline with eyes that held genuine affection, despite his training. And she realized that even David's most carefully laid plans couldn't account for the unpredictable nature of love and loyalty. "Whatever David has planned for us," Caroline said, reaching down to stroke Scout's head, "he's made one crucial mistake. He's given us each other as allies, and he's given me something worth protecting again." The sound of another vehicle approaching up the mountain road announced that the final confrontation was about to begin. David Torres was coming to claim his revenge, armed with evidence of deception and years of carefully nurtured rage. But Caroline Torres was no longer the broken woman who had fled Denver 15 years ago. And she wasn't facing this battle alone. The envelope Dr. Harrison had brought contained one final document that changed everything Caroline thought she knew about her son's last days. Hidden beneath the DNA results and surveillance photographs was a letter written in Tommy's careful 12-year-old handwriting, addressed to her but never delivered. "Where did you get this?" Caroline asked, her hands shaking as she recognized her son's distinctive script. "David found it among Tommy's personal effects after he died," Harrison explained. "Apparently, Tommy had asked a nurse to mail it to you, but it was misplaced during the chaos of his final hospitalization. David discovered it last year while going through old medical records." Caroline unfolded the letter with reverent care, seeing her son's words for the first time 15 years after his death. "Dear Mom, I know you're scared about the treatments not working anymore. I heard you and Dad talking in the hallway, even though you thought I was sleeping. I want you to know that I'm not scared of dying. I'm more scared of you and Dad being sad forever. I know you're trying to protect me from the painful treatments, and I know Dad wants to keep fighting no matter what. You're both right in different ways, but I need to tell you something important. I forgive you for whatever choice you make. I forgive Dad too. I remember when we got Buster, and you taught me that sometimes loving something means letting it go when it's suffering. I think maybe that's true for people too. I don't want you to feel guilty if you decide to let me go peacefully." I just want you to know that I love you and I'm grateful for all the good times we had. Please don't let my dying make you stop living. Please don't let it make you and Dad hate each other. I want you both to be happy again someday. I love you forever. Tommy P.S. The compass in my Boy Scout kit is for you. Dad always says a good compass helps you find your way when you're lost. I hope it helps you find your way back to being happy. Caroline collapsed into her chair, the letter clutched against her chest as 15 years of carefully controlled grief finally broke free. Tommy had known. Somehow her 12-year-old son had understood the impossible position she was in and had tried to free her from the guilt that had consumed her life. He had forgiven her before she even knew she needed forgiveness. Scout immediately moved to her side, pressing his warm body against her legs in a gesture of comfort that transcended his training. The dog's loyalty had evolved beyond David's programming, becoming something genuine and protective that recognized Caroline's pain as worthy of healing rather than exploitation. He knew, Caroline whispered through her tears. He knew what choice I was going to make, and he was trying to protect me from feeling guilty about it. Harrison knelt beside her chair, his own eyes wet with grief for the son he had never known. He sounds like a remarkable boy, the kind of child who would grow up to be someone extraordinary. The sound of David's approaching vehicle grew louder, and Caroline forced herself to focus on the immediate crisis. Her ex-husband was coming armed with evidence of deception and years of stored rage. But Tommy's letter had given her something more powerful, proof that her son had understood her choice and forgiven her for it. We need to choose where this confrontation happens, Caroline said, wiping her eyes and moving into strategic mode. David has been planning this for 2 years, which means he's probably prepared for multiple scenarios. Harrison nodded, recognizing the wisdom in taking control of the situation's parameters. What do you suggest? Caroline looked out her window at Tommy's memorial stone, the small cairn she had built as a shrine to her grief and guilt. For 15 years, she had visited that pile of stones as a penitent seeking forgiveness from a son who had already granted it. Now she understood that the memorial wasn't just about Tommy. It was about her own need to transform grief into something constructive rather than destructive. Tommy's memorial, Caroline said. If David wants to have this conversation in my son's name, then we'll have it at the place where I've been honoring his memory for 15 years. She retrieved her son's compass from the place of honor where she kept it on her mantelpiece, a simple Boy Scout instrument that had guided countless hiking trips and outdoor adventures. Tommy's final gift to her, offered with the wisdom of a child who understood that sometimes you have to lose your way before you can find the path home. Scout's behavior shifted as Caroline prepared for the confrontation, his conflict between training and loyalty becoming more apparent. The dog understood that his original mission was nearing completion, but his bond with Caroline had created competing priorities that his handlers hadn't anticipated. I need you to know something, Caroline said to Scout, kneeling beside him and meeting his intelligent brown eyes. Whatever happens next, whatever David has trained you to do, I want you to choose your own path. You don't owe loyalty to people who use you as a weapon. The dog tilted his head at her words, and Caroline could see understanding in his expression. Scout had been conditioned to serve David's agenda, but 15 years in the mountains had taught Caroline to recognize genuine emotion when she saw it. The dog's affection for her was real, independent of his training, and that gave her hope that he would make the right choice when the moment came. Deputy Santos arrived just as David's black SUV became visible on the mountain road, a patrol car's presence adding an official dimension to the confrontation that David probably hadn't anticipated. Caroline had called her earlier, explaining the situation and requesting backup for what was likely to become a dangerous encounter. "Are you sure you want to do this here?" Deputy Santos asked, checking her radio and adjusting her position to have clear sight lines of the approaching vehicle. "We could arrange a controlled meeting at the station with proper security protocols." Caroline shook her head, clutching Tommy's compass in her palm. This needs to happen where it started, with Tommy's memory. David has been using our son's name to justify his actions for 2 years. It's time to let Tommy speak for himself. Harrison positioned himself between Caroline and the approaching SUV, his medical training making him automatically assess potential threats and escape routes. David has had 2 years to plan this confrontation. We need to be prepared for anything. As David's vehicle came to a stop near the cabin, Caroline could see her ex-husband through the windshield, older now, his dark hair streaked with grey, but still carrying himself with the rigid control she remembered from their worst fights during Tommy's illness. He sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, studying the scene before him with calculating eyes. Scout whined softly and moved closer to Caroline, his body language shifting from surveillance mode to protective stance. Whatever his original programming, the dog had made his choice about where his loyalty belonged. "Remember," Caroline said to Harrison and Deputy Santos, "David isn't a criminal. He's a grieving father who has convinced himself that revenge will somehow bring peace. He's dangerous because he believes his cause is righteous, not because he's inherently violent." David finally emerged from his SUV, carrying a thick briefcase that presumably contained additional evidence of his case against Caroline and Harrison. He was dressed formally despite the mountain setting, a dark suit that suggested he viewed this encounter as a kind of trial where he would serve as prosecutor. "Judge and jury, Caroline," David said, his voice carrying across the distance between them with the measured tone of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times. "Dr. Harrison, thank you both for being here." His polite formality was more unsettling than outright hostility would have been. Caroline could see the controlled rage beneath David's civilized exterior, the years of accumulated anger held in check by his need to orchestrate this confrontation according to his carefully laid plans. "Hello, David," Caroline replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I received your letters." "Then you understand why we're here," David said, opening his briefcase and retrieving a thick folder. 15 years ago, both of you made choices that betrayed our son's memory. Today, you're going to acknowledge those choices and accept responsibility for their consequences." Deputy Santos stepped forward, her hand resting casually on her service weapon. "Mr. Torres, I need to inform you that stalking and surveillance activities are criminal offenses. Before we proceed with any conversation, I want to make sure everyone understands the legal implications of what's been happening here." David's expression tightened with annoyance at the interruption of his planned script. "Officer, this is a private family matter. These people have committed moral crimes that go far beyond your jurisdiction. Actually, sir, monitoring someone without consent using electronic surveillance equipment is very much within my jurisdiction," Santos replied firmly, "as is using trained animals to restrict someone's movement against their will." Caroline watched David process this unexpected complication to his plans. He had anticipated emotional confrontation and psychological manipulation, but the presence of law enforcement forced him to adjust his approach in real time. The surveillance was necessary to ensure both parties would be available for this meeting, David said carefully. "I needed to know that Caroline wouldn't run away again, as she has for the past 15 years. And what exactly did you hope to accomplish with this meeting?" Harrison asked, his medical training making him naturally inclined to probe for underlying motivations. David's controlled facade began to crack as he shifted his attention to Tommy's biological father. "You want to know what I hope to accomplish? I hope to hear you both admit what your lies cost our son. I hope to see you take responsibility for the deception that defined his entire life." The pain in David's voice was raw and genuine, cutting through his calculated presentation to reveal the wounded father underneath. Caroline recognized the grief that had consumed him for 15 years, the need to find someone to blame for a tragedy that had no real villain. "Tommy knew," Caroline said quietly, holding up her son's letter. "He knew about the choice I was going to make, and he forgave me for it. He forgave all of us." David's eyes fixed on the letter with laser intensity. What is that? A letter Tommy wrote to me before he died, Caroline explained. A letter you found but never delivered. He knew we were all doing our best in an impossible situation, and he didn't want his death to destroy the people he loved. The revelation that Caroline had Tommy's final letter clearly wasn't part of David's script. He had planned this confrontation around specific evidence and anticipated responses, but his son's own words introduced a variable he hadn't prepared for. "Let me see it," David demanded, his composure beginning to fracture. Caroline looked at Deputy Santos, who nodded slightly. She walked slowly toward David, Tommy's compass in one hand and his letter in the other. "Scout's staying close beside her for protection. Read it yourself," Caroline said, handing over the letter that had taken 15 years to reach her. "But remember, these are Tommy's words, not mine. These are his feelings about the choices we all made." As David read his son's letter, Caroline watched years of carefully constructed rage begin to crumble. The evidence he had assembled, the surveillance he had orchestrated, the elaborate plan for psychological revenge, all of it was suddenly measured against Tommy's own voice, calling for forgiveness and understanding. "He knew," David whispered, his hands trembling as he held the letter. "He knew what we were going through, and he was trying to protect us from ourselves." Caroline nodded, feeling some of the anger she had carried toward David begin to soften. "He was wiser at 12 than any of us have been since then. He understood something we forgot, that love means wanting the people you care about to be happy, even when you can't be with them anymore." Scout pressed closer to Caroline as David processed his son's final message, the dog's protective instincts fully engaged despite his original training. The animal had chosen his side, and Caroline felt a surge of gratitude for this unexpected ally in the confrontation she had spent 15 years dreading. The memorial stone stood silent in Caroline's garden, waiting for the resolution that would finally bring peace to Tommy's memory and the people who had loved him. The compass in Caroline's hand pointed steady and true, guiding her toward a confrontation that might finally heal the wounds that had defined too many lives for too many years. The walk to Tommy's memorial stone felt like a procession through 15 years of accumulated grief. Caroline led the way, her son's compass steady in her palm, pointing toward the small cairn she had built with her own hands from river rocks, carried up the mountain one by one. Each stone had been a prayer, a plea for forgiveness, a desperate attempt to create something beautiful from the wreckage of her shattered life. David followed in silence, Tommy's letter clutched against his chest like a shield against the emotions threatening to overwhelm his carefully constructed plans. The revelation that their son had foreseen and forgiven the choice Caroline would make had shaken the foundation of the revenge he had spent 2 years orchestrating. Dr. Harrison walked beside Deputy Santos, both of them maintaining careful awareness of the volatile dynamics between Caroline and David. Scout stayed close to Caroline's side, his loyalty now clearly established despite the conflict with his original training. The memorial stone sat in a grove of aspen trees that turned golden every October, creating a natural cathedral that Caroline had chosen for its peaceful beauty. She had built the cairn carefully, balancing each rock with the precision of someone creating a work of art rather than just a pile of stones. For 15 years, this had been her sanctuary within a sanctuary, the most sacred space in her carefully constructed exile. "This is where I've come every day to remember Tommy," Caroline said, as they gathered around the memorial. "Every morning and every evening for 15 years, I've sat here and tried to make sense of losing him." David approached the cairn with reverent steps, his anger momentarily displaced by the obvious love and care Caroline had invested in honoring their son's memory. The stones were arranged with mathematical precision, each one chosen for its size and shape. The entire structure designed to last through mountain weather and seasonal changes. "You built this for him," David said, his voice thick with unexpected emotion. "I built it for all of us," Caroline replied. "For Tommy, yes, but also for the family we used to be before cancer took him away from us. I needed a place where the good memories could live alongside the grief. Harrison studied the memorial with professional appreciation for its craftsmanship and obvious emotional significance. It's beautiful, Caroline. Tommy would have been proud of what you created in his honor. The comment triggered something explosive in David's carefully controlled demeanor. Don't you dare, he snarled, wheeling on Harrison with fury that had been building for 2 years. You don't get to talk about what Tommy would have wanted. You didn't even know he existed. Harrison stepped back but held his ground, recognizing that David's rage was born from pain rather than genuine malice. You're right, he said calmly. I didn't know about Tommy, and I've had to live with that loss since learning the truth. But I'm here now, trying to understand and honor his memory the best way I can. Honor his memory? David's voice rose to a shout that echoed off the surrounding mountains. You want to honor his memory? Then admit what your ignorance cost him. Admit that he might have lived if you had been there to help with his medical care instead of leaving everything to me. The accusation hung in the mountain air like a physical presence. Caroline could see the pain beneath David's anger, the exhaustion of a father who had fought alone for his son's life, who had carried the financial and emotional burden of catastrophic illness without knowing that the child's biological father was a successful physician with resources that might have made a difference. David, Caroline said gently, Tommy's cancer wasn't anyone's fault. Not yours, not mine, not Dr. Harrison's. Sometimes terrible things happen to good people, and there's no one to blame for it. But there is someone to blame for the lies. David shot back, turning his fury on Caroline. There is someone to blame for the deception that meant I raised another man's child as my own, loved him as my own, sacrificed everything for him as my own, while his real father lived in ignorance. The raw pain in David's voice cut through Caroline's defenses, forcing her to confront the full impact of the choice she had made 16 years earlier. She had told herself that David's love for Tommy made biological parentage irrelevant, but she had never considered how the truth might affect him if it were ever discovered. I thought I was protecting everyone, Caroline said, her own voice breaking. I thought David would love Tommy just as much whether he was his biological son or not. And I thought Dr. Harrison would be better off not knowing about a child he couldn't help raise. Protecting everyone except Tommy, David accused. What about protecting his right to know his real father? What about protecting his right to have access to his biological father's medical expertise and resources? Scout whined softly and pressed closer to Caroline as the emotional temperature of the confrontation escalated. Deputy Santos moved into a position where she could intervene quickly if the verbal conflict became physical, her training alert to the signs of potentially dangerous emotional volatility. Tommy knew he was loved, Harrison said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent his career dealing with family medical crises. Whatever mistakes the adults in his life made, that boy knew he was cherished by everyone around him. That's what matters most for a child's emotional well-being. David's response was immediate and vicious. Don't you dare psychoanalyze our situation. You're the one who created this mess with your affair with my wife. You're the one who made it possible for Tommy to die, never knowing who his real father was. The words hit Harrison like physical blows, and Caroline could see him struggling with guilt that mirrored her own. Dr. Michael Harrison was a good man who had been caught up in a situation he never fully understood, forced to carry responsibility for consequences he never had the chance to prevent. Stop, Caroline said, her voice cutting through the exchange with surprising strength. Both of you just stop. This isn't what Tommy would want, and you know it. She held up her son's letter, the paper trembling in her hands, but her voice growing steadier with each word. Tommy wrote that he was more scared of us being sad forever than he was of dying. He begged us not to let his death make us hate each other. And what have we done? We've spent 15 years doing exactly what he was afraid we would do. The truth of her words seemed to echo off the mountains themselves, highlighting the futility of the anger and blame that had consumed all of their lives since Tommy's death. Caroline looked at the memorial stone, then at the compass in her other hand, and felt something shift inside her chest, a settling, like a broken bone, finally healing properly after being set in the right position. "David," she said, meeting her ex-husband's eyes directly for the first time since he had arrived. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you the truth about Tommy's parentage. I'm sorry you carried the burden of his illness alone, when there was someone else who could have helped. I'm sorry my choices caused you pain that lasted long after our son was gone." The apology seemed to deflate some of David's rage, leaving him looking older and more fragile than Caroline remembered. "I loved him so much," he whispered. "Even knowing the truth, even knowing he wasn't genetically mine, I loved him so much. But it felt like everything I thought I knew about our family was a lie." Harrison stepped forward cautiously, his voice gentle with understanding. "David, love isn't about genetics. The father Tommy knew and trusted was you. You were the one who taught him to throw a baseball, who read him bedtime stories, who held his hand during treatments. Biology doesn't change any of that." But Caroline could see that reason and logic weren't going to be enough to resolve the emotional damage that had been building for 2 years. David's need for confrontation went deeper than intellectual understanding. It was primal, visceral, born from a father's grief that had been twisted into something destructive by the revelation of deception. The memorial stone stood silent between them, a monument to love and loss that had witnessed Caroline's daily vigils for 15 years. Tommy's compass pointed steady and true in her palm, and she realized that her son had been right about its purpose. A good compass did help you find your way when you were lost. But the path home wasn't going to be easy, and the confrontation that had been building for 2 years was just beginning to reach its true climax. David's breakdown came suddenly and violently. 2 years of controlled rage finally exploding beyond his ability to contain it. He lunged toward the memorial stone as if he could somehow reach through it to the son he had lost, his carefully planned confrontation dissolving into raw, primal grief. "It should have been me," David sobbed, falling to his knees beside the cairn Caroline had built. "Tommy should have lived, and I should have died instead. I failed him. I failed to protect him, failed to save him, failed to even know who his real father was." Caroline's heart broke, watching her ex-husband collapse under the weight of guilt she understood all too well. For 15 years, they had both been carrying impossible burdens of responsibility for a tragedy that had been beyond anyone's control. But while Caroline had channeled her grief into building something beautiful in Tommy's memory, David had turned his inward, letting it fester into something destructive. Harrison moved toward David with the instinctive compassion of a physician. But Caroline's ex-husband recoiled from any offer of comfort from Tommy's biological father. The proximity of the man who represented everything David felt he had failed to be was too much to bear. "Don't touch me," David snarled, his grief morphing back into anger as he struggled to his feet. "This is all your fault. If you had stayed away from my wife, if you had kept your hands to yourself, Tommy would have lived a real life with a real father instead of the lie I represented." The accusation was irrational, born from pain rather than logic, but Caroline could see it was pushing Harrison toward his own breaking point. Dr. Michael Harrison was a man accustomed to saving lives, to having answers for impossible medical situations, and the helplessness of this emotional crisis was clearly taking its toll. "David, you were Tommy's real father in every way that mattered," Harrison said, his professional calm beginning to crack. "I may have contributed genetic material, but you raised him, loved him, fought for him. That's what makes someone a real father. Real fathers don't let their children die," David shot back, his voice raw with self-loathing. "Real fathers find ways to save them, no matter what the doctors say, no matter how hopeless it seems." The words hit Caroline like physical blows because she recognized the thought pattern that had consumed her own life for 15 years. The magical thinking that insisted love should be powerful enough to overcome cancer. That good parents should be able to protect their children from every possible harm. That there must be someone to blame when the impossible happens to innocent people. David, Caroline said, her voice cutting through his spiraling self-destruction. Tommy didn't die because we failed him. Tommy died because sometimes 12-year-old children get cancer, and sometimes even the best medical care isn't enough to save them. But her ex-husband was beyond hearing reason. The presence of Tommy's biological father, the revelation of Caroline's deception, the discovery of their son's final letter, all of it had combined to shatter the psychological walls David had built to contain his grief. "You gave up on him," David accused, turning his fury back on Caroline. "When the doctors said the treatments weren't working, you chose to let him die instead of fighting for every possible chance." The old argument, the one that had destroyed their marriage and driven Caroline to the mountains, erupted between them with all the force of accumulated years. Caroline felt herself transported back to those horrible final weeks in the hospital, when hope had become a form of torture, and every decision felt like a betrayal of someone she loved. Scout positioned himself between Caroline and David as the emotional temperature reached dangerous levels, the dog's protective instincts overriding any residual training that might have made him loyal to David's agenda. The animal's choice was clear. He had seen enough of Caroline's character to make his own moral judgment about who deserved his protection. Deputy Santos stepped forward, her hand moving toward her service weapon as she assessed the potential for physical violence. "Mr. Torres, I need you to step back and take some deep breaths. Everyone here loved Tommy and wanted what was best for him. Nobody is the villain in this situation, but David was beyond hearing official intervention." He reached into his jacket and pulled out an object that made Caroline's blood run cold, an emergency flare gun she recognized from her own survival equipment. Somehow, during his surveillance of her property, David had gained access to her cabin and taken one of her emergency signaling devices. "You want to know what Tommy would have wanted?" David said, his voice eerily calm as he held the flare gun with practiced confidence. "He would have wanted his real father to know about him. He would have wanted honesty instead of lies. He would have wanted parents who fought for him instead of giving up." Harrison raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, his medical training making him automatically assess the potential for serious injury from the improvised weapon. "David, please. This isn't going to bring Tommy back or solve anything." Caroline realized with crystal clarity that David's surveillance operation had been more extensive than anyone had understood. He had been inside her cabin, studying her routines and resources, planning for contingencies that went far beyond simple confrontation. The flare gun wasn't just a random weapon, it was a deliberate choice meant to symbolize her failure to properly signal for help when Tommy was dying. "Put the flare gun down." "David," Caroline said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, "Tommy wouldn't want you to hurt anyone in his name. You know that." But as David's finger moved toward the trigger, Caroline understood that words weren't going to be enough to resolve this crisis. The flare gun represented everything David blamed her for. Her failure to fight hard enough, her choice to let Tommy go peacefully, her decision to signal the end instead of calling for more desperate measures. Scout's low growl was the only warning before the dog made his choice, launching himself toward David with the protective fury of an animal defending his chosen family. The collision knocked David off balance just as the flare gun discharged, sending a brilliant red streak across the mountain sky instead of into Caroline's chest. Deputy Santos moved immediately to secure the weapon, while Caroline and Harrison both rushed to help David, who had fallen hard against Tommy's memorial stone. The cairn remained intact, but David was bleeding from a gash on his forehead where he had struck the rocks. As the emergency flare burned out overhead, Caroline knelt beside her ex-husband and pressed her hands against his wound, stanching the bleeding with the same careful attention she had given to Scout's injuries days earlier. The cycle of hurt and healing, of breaking and mending, seemed to define her relationship with everyone she had ever loved. "It's going to be all right," Caroline whispered to David, meaning it for the first time in 15 years. We're all going to be all right." 6 months later, Caroline stood in her garden, watching Scout chase autumn leaves with the pure joy of an animal who had learned to trust happiness again. The dog wore a new collar now, sturdy leather with 2 tags. One bore his chosen name, Scout, engraved in simple letters. The other carried Tommy, not as a burden or manipulation, but as an honor and remembrance of the boy who had brought them all together across the impossible distances of grief and time. The legal resolution of David's actions had been surprisingly gentle. Deputy Santos had worked with prosecutors who understood that domestic violence often grew from untreated trauma rather than inherent criminality. David had entered a residential therapy program that specialized in complicated grief, spending months learning to process his loss without destroying himself or others. His letters to Caroline now carried a different tone, still sad, but no longer poisoned with rage. Dr. Michael Harrison had made an unexpected decision to relocate his medical practice to Colorado, accepting a position at the regional hospital 40 miles from Caroline's mountain sanctuary. He wasn't trying to insert himself into her life, but rather to be available for the gradual process of understanding their shared connection to Tommy's memory. Their conversations were careful and respectful. 2 adults learning to navigate a relationship built on loss, but growing toward something more positive, frank. Dalton had become Caroline's bridge back to the human community. She had abandoned 15 years earlier. The old rancher had never asked for details about the confrontation that brought police cars to her mountain, but he had quietly increased his visits and invitations, drawing her gently back into social connections without pressuring her to explain her past. Caroline had made her own surprising decision to volunteer with the county search and rescue team, using Scouts' professional training for genuine humanitarian purposes instead of the surveillance and manipulation David had intended. The dog's ability to locate missing persons had found new purpose in helping lost hikers and children, transforming him from a weapon into a guardian. The work suited both of them. Caroline's 15 years of mountain experience had given her skills that proved invaluable in wilderness emergencies, while Scouts' training and Caroline's compassion made them an effective team. More importantly, the volunteer work gave Caroline a way to honor Tommy's memory through service to others, channeling her grief into something constructive and healing. On this particular October morning, Caroline made her usual pilgrimage to Tommy's memorial stone, but the ritual felt different now. Instead of carrying guilt and regret to the cairn, she brought gratitude and stories of the lives she and Scout had helped save. The memorial had become less about apologizing to the dead and more about celebrating the ongoing possibility of protecting the living. "We helped find that missing girl last week," Caroline told the memorial, settling cross-legged beside the carefully arranged stones. 8 years old, lost for 2 days in the national forest. Scout tracked her to a cave where she'd taken shelter, and she was scared but unharmed. Her parents cried when we brought her home. Scout settled beside Caroline with the easy contentment of an animal who understood his purpose in the world. The conflict between his original training and his genuine loyalties had been resolved through months of patient work, transforming him from a surveillance tool into a search and rescue professional who chose his missions based on love rather than obligation. Caroline had kept Tommy's compass, using it during search and rescue operations as both a practical tool and a spiritual connection to her son's wisdom about finding your way when lost. The simple instrument had guided her through many wilderness emergencies, but more importantly, it had helped her navigate the emotional terrain that led from isolation back to community. The changes in her life had been gradual but profound. She still lived in her mountain cabin, still treasured her solitude and independence, but she no longer used isolation as armor against potential hurt. She had learned the difference between healthy boundaries and destructive withdrawal, between protecting herself and imprisoning herself in fear. Her relationship with David remained complicated, but was healing slowly. His therapy had helped him understand that Caroline's choices during Tommy's final illness had been motivated by love rather than weakness, while Caroline had learned to forgive David's grief-driven actions without excusing their harmful impact. They would never be friends, but they had found a way to share Tommy's memory without weaponizing it against each other. Dr. Harrison's presence in her life was perhaps the most unexpected development. Their relationship was careful and respectful, built on shared grief but growing toward genuine friendship. He had asked nothing from her beyond the opportunity to hear stories about the son he had never known, and Caroline had found peace in sharing those memories with someone who understood their precious value. "I think you would like Dr. Harrison," Caroline told Tommy's memorial. "He's patient and kind, and he asks good questions about science and medicine the way you used to. He's not trying to replace anyone or change anything. He just wants to understand who you were and honor what you meant to all of us." Scout lifted his head at the sound of a vehicle approaching on the mountain road. Caroline recognized Frank Dalton's pickup truck, right on schedule for their weekly dinner tradition. The old rancher had become her anchor to the community below, ensuring she never drifted too far back into the isolation that had once seemed like her only protection against pain. As Frank's truck came to a stop near her cabin, Caroline stood and brushed dirt from her jeans, ready to rejoin the world of the living. The memorial stone would remain where she had built it, a testament to love and loss and the possibility of healing. But it no longer defined the boundaries of her existence. "Come on." "Scout," Caroline said, clicking her tongue to call the dog to her side. "Frank's probably brought news from town. And I promised Dr. Chen I'd stop by the clinic tomorrow to discuss that search and rescue training program." Scout bounded to her side with tail wagging, wearing his new collar with pride and carrying his head high with the confidence of an animal who knew he was loved for who he was rather than what he could be trained to do. The tags clinked softly as he moved. Scout and Tommy, past and present, loss and healing, all carried forward together into whatever came next. Caroline walked toward Frank's truck with Tommy's compass steady in her pocket and her son's wisdom finally integrated into her heart. Sometimes the hardest thing about losing your way was learning to trust the path back home. But with patience and courage and the love of both old friends and new, even the longest exile could eventually end. The mountains stretched endlessly around them, beautiful and serene, no longer a fortress against the world, but a foundation for whatever life she chose to build. Caroline Torres had found her way back from the wilderness of grief, and she was ready to help others do the same.